Today we will finish up our look at the Cold War. Along the way, we will look at what made Americans fearful at home, Nixon's fall from grace, Reagan's rise to prominence, and the fall of the Berlin Wall, and ultimately the Soviet Union. In the end, capitalism and democracy would prevail over communism and totalitarianism. It's Cold War Part 4. There were two things Americans feared during the Cold War. The first was the fear that the world would come to an end through nuclear weapons. Both sides possessed enough weapons to destroy the other. Remember, the closest the world came to nuclear war was the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. The other fear was communism. There was a paranoia in the United States that there were communists everywhere, ready to undermine the United States. In just a minute, we will look at how politicians address this fear. To give the people a sense that there was something to do in the event of a nuclear attack, Americans were told to duck and cover. Bert the Turtle taught kids this lesson, and students practiced this in their schools. What they were not told was that if they saw the flash, they probably would not get the chance to either duck or cover. Another way Americans addressed this fear was home builders started building homes with bomb shelters. The government encouraged Americans to build shelters to take cover in the event of a nuclear attack. And many Americans took this advice and stocked these shelters with food, water, batteries, radios, and flashlights, enough for their family to live in until all was clear. The fear of communism at home led the government to pass a series of laws that questioned the loyalty of many Americans. The Federal Employee Loyalty Program allowed the government to review the loyalty of those people working for the government. Loyalty boards were set up, and they went after certain people, targeting people who obviously they thought who had communist sympathies. And by 1951, 212 employees had been dismissed from the government, and over 2,000 had resigned. The McCarran Act required that any communist organization to register with the government, they also had to publish any of their records. Anyone who was communist might be denied a passport or prohibited from working in the defense industry. And individuals who were thought to be communists were not allowed to enter the United States. During the Truman administration, Republicans tried to link Harry Truman and the Democratic Party to being sympathetic with communism. Republicans used the House Un-American Activities Committee to investigate the movie industry during the Truman administration. The Republicans charged that American films were full of Soviet propaganda. This led to the creation of a blacklist in Hollywood where some 500 actors, directors, producers, and writers would not be able to work because it was suspected that they were either communists or they had been somehow linked to communist activities. This fear became a reality for many Americans with two high-profile espionage cases. Alger Hiss, who worked for the State Department, was accused by Whittaker Chambers, a confessed Soviet agent, of spying for the Soviet Union. Hiss was accused of stealing State Department documents. Whittaker Chambers even led investigators to Hiss's farm, where copies of documents were found in hollowed-out pumpkins. After 2 trials, Alger Hiss was convicted of perjury to the House Un-American Activities Committee and sentenced to 5 years in prison. They couldn't charge him with espionage because the statute of limitations for that charge had passed. Ethel and Julius Rosenberg were charged with what for many Americans was the ultimate betrayal, providing the Soviet Union with nuclear information. Coming on the heels of the first atomic bomb being tested by the Soviet Union in 1949, the Rosenberg case garnered a lot of attention. Karl Fuchs had admitted to giving the Soviets the information and claimed that the Rosenbergs were behind the plot. The Rosenbergs denied these charges against them and claimed that they were being victimized because they were Jewish and they held what many believed were radical beliefs, and they were members of the American Communist Party. They were found guilty and sentenced to death. The judge declared that their crimes were worse than murder, and in spite of calls for clemency, they were executed in July 1953, becoming the first American civilians to be executed for espionage. Preying on the fears held by many Americans was Wisconsin Senator Joe McCarthy, who went from being an obscure member of Congress to the front page of the newspaper through his claims that communists were taking over the American government. In 1950, he claimed to possess a list of 205 known communists that at the time were employed in the State Department, despite the fact that he never produced a single name. He attacked Presidents Truman and Eisenhower for allowing these communists to hold such high government positions. McCarthy held highly publicized hearings where he would badger witnesses and come across as a bully. And again, many would refer to this as a witch hunt in the 20th century. Despite all of these claims from McCarthy, they never produced any conclusive evidence that there was any federal employees with communist ties. Thus, the phrase McCarthyism is to accuse people of disloyalty without evidence. In 1954, the people would tire of Joe McCarthy when he made accusations against the U.S. Army, claiming that there were communists who were taking over the Army. And in the televised hearings, McCarthy comes across, again, as a bully and doesn't provide a lot of support for what he's claiming. And eventually what we see is even his own party votes to censor him, and this will really mark the end of Joe McCarthy, who will die shortly after the Army hearings. We talked about how Mao Zedong had turned China into a communist country after their civil war. But the United States had always recognized Taiwan as a legitimate government of China. And while the United States feared China and the Soviet Union would become strong allies in the region, over time they became rivals for territory and influence. In 1972, President Richard Nixon would go to China and meet Mao, the communist leader of China, and begin an economic and diplomatic relationship. This relationship is obviously still important to the United States today. Richard Nixon had been easily elected with 61% of the vote over George McGovern in 1968. Going back to his loss to John F. Kennedy in 1960, Nixon had always been paranoid. Nixon enjoyed support for his domestic policies, but the war in Vietnam had not yet ended by the time the election came in 1972. And during that campaign, 5 men broke into the Democratic National Committee's headquarters at the Watergate in Washington, D.C. Before they were caught, their plan was to wiretap the offices and copy strategy documents of the Democratic Party. While denying any knowledge of the event, it quickly became evident through the work of Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein at the Washington Post that the Nixon administration was working to cover up the break-in by paying the men for their silence, destroying documents, and pressuring the FBI to not investigate the break-in. When the Senate launched an investigation in 1973, it became apparent that Nixon was involved. A taping system in the Oval Office recorded all conversations, and these tapes clearly identified Nixon's role in the cover-up. And after the release of these tapes, which were not released until after a court challenge, Richard Nixon, basically knowing that he would be impeached and removed from office, would become the first U.S. president to resign the presidency on August 8, 1974. His vice president, Spiro Agnew, had been forced to resign a year earlier after he was charged with accepting bribes as governor of Maryland and vice president of the United States. This led to the ascension of Gerald Ford to the office of vice president and eventually the president after Nixon left office. The Watergate scandal ushered in a time when the Americans had strong negative feelings towards their government and did not trust them, really something that has not gone away to this day. In 1980, former actor and governor of California, Ronald Reagan, was elected president, defeating Democrat Jimmy Carter. The election of Ronald Reagan ushered in an era of conservatism that focused on small government and low taxes. And when it came to foreign policy in the Cold War, Ronald Reagan restoked the Cold War flames that had died down under Carter. He labeled the Soviet Union the evil empire and dramatically increased defense spending, ultimately putting economic and military pressure on the Soviet Union. An important development at the time in the Soviet Union was the rise of reform-minded Mikhail Gorbachev as the leader of the Soviet Union in 1985. As we discussed earlier, Germany was divided between the Soviet Union and the West. And by 1961, 20% of East Germans had left East Germany for the West. To stop this, Nikita Khrushchev had ordered the construction of the Berlin Wall in August 1961. There were armed guards, and the wall did slow the spread of people from east to west, and it became a symbol of the Cold War and the struggle between the United States and the Soviet Union. In June 1987, Ronald Reagan went to the Brandenburg Gate in West Germany in front of the wall and had made a challenge to the Soviet premier. He said, "General Secretary Gorbachev, if you seek peace, if you seek prosperity for the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, if you seek liberalization, come here to this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. Reagan's challenge came at a time when the Soviet Union was struggling to hold on to its position in the world. It was a time when Gorbachev was looking to reform the Soviet Union, and ultimately there were several factors that would bring an end to the Cold War. Reagan's push for increased defense spending led to the Soviet Union trying to keep up. Reagan announced the Strategic Defense Initiative, which is pictured there, and called Star Wars by its critics. It was an attempt to shoot missiles down from space. This led to the Soviet Union increasing its arsenal. This military spending would cause many issues for the struggling Soviet Union. The rise of Gorbachev to power in the Soviet Union in 1985 would lead to tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union reducing. He would initiate a series of reforms that would change communism in the Soviet Union. Glasnost involved the elimination of many repressive policies in the Soviet Union. Under Gorbachev, Soviets could speak more freely, organize politically, criticize the government, and even have a free press. Perestroika led to a major change in the Soviet economy, allowing for private ownership and for people to make a profit. There was less government control of the economy. It really were steps towards a more capitalist system in the Soviet Union. And as I mentioned earlier, the military spending was killing the Soviet economy. In 1986, Gorbachev and Reagan met in Iceland to discuss reducing the size of their nuclear arsenals. And in 1988, the two sides started reducing the number of missiles each had in Europe. The Cold War was thawing. And on November 9, 1989, the Berlin Wall came down, allowing the free passage from east to west for the first time in almost 30 years. Quite the celebration broke out in Germany, and the fall of the Berlin Wall marked the symbolic end of the Cold War. Let's close the show by looking at nationalism in Soviet republics and the end of the Cold War. In 1991, 14 Soviet republics declared their independence from the Soviet Union. Countries like Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, Hungary, and Poland were now free from Soviet control. And it was this independence that really marks the end of the Cold War. The 46-year struggle between democracy and capitalism against communism and totalitarianism had ended, and the side of democracy had been successful. We will look at the civil rights movement next time. Until then, good night, Albuquerque.